We really discuss the general idea, United States pivoting away from the Middle East and going to East Asia, whether it is fact or fiction. We believe it's total fiction. The United States is not leaving the area, and the United States has a lot of security, economic, and political interest to defend in the region.
The U.S. is now in a very competitive field, not just of the superpowers, Russia, China, and the U.S., but also of regional superpowers. And we see the evidence of the activities of these powers in the Middle East, from Syria to Afghanistan to Iraq to Yemen. And the U.S. has not adjusted to what should its role be, what can its role be in this competitive field. It is no longer a dominant power in the Middle East, but it has not yet made the transition to being one of several big players and define what exactly it wants to do.
The United States is losing influence in the Middle East and North Africa to a certain extent. Not because the United States has lost interest in the region, or because it doesn't have significant assets, both diplomatic and military, to bring to bear on the solution of problems or security threats in the region, but because the relative power of its near-peer competitors, primarily China, but also Russia, is also growing, as is their interest in the region of the Middle East. So now the United States, which was, let's be honest, a fairly unchallenged hegemon in the region for a number of decades, now as company on that stage, has to compete with Russia and China for influence, including among America's closest allies.
And here, for the US, it's about containing Russia, which is no longer a superpower and smarting from it, but also mitigating the effects of rivalry with China, which is increasingly being pulled into the MENA region given its way of doing business. And this way of doing business is to prioritize trade, investment, and common interests without interfering in domestic affairs, while embodying a paternalistic model of governance. And here, this model of governance is really appealing to the region's autocrats. And so we effectively have a quintessential consolidation as a result of autocracies with a new authoritarian playbook as liberal values and US internationalism wanes. This neither bodes well for US influence, nor does it bode well for the region's trajectory.
And I think that this often asked question about a US pivot from or to the Middle East is really the wrong way to think about this. Rather, we should think about the predominant global paradigms that shape US policy options. And today there are some real questions about what those paradigms are and if one actually exists. And I think when put into historical context, this raises some real problems for the US-Israel relationship, which previously had been defined by far more structured paradigms like the Cold War and like the global war on terror.
The influence will be minimal because Egypt is so heavily reliant on the United States for its military arms purchases, as well as the $1.3 billion of annual military aid that the U.S. provides, with which Egypt must purchase U.S. weapons and equipment with. Now, that being said, China has over the past few years increased its trade with Egypt, although that has created a deficit in the Egyptian trade balance. But that relationship is likely to increase because China may be the only country willing to engage in foreign investment in Egypt. But I think overall, Egypt is unlikely to change its reliance on the United States. whether it's militarily or whether it's financially. But that does not necessarily mean that the entire region will not be affected by the rise of China.
Here in the United States, the shale revolution has made the United States the biggest producer of oil and natural gas in the world. In fact, the United States has gone from being the world's biggest importer of fossil fuels to being a significant exporter. And so a myth has formed that the United States no longer needs to worry about its dependence on Middle East oil. And the reason why it's a myth is because of two factors. So first, while the United States does not buy much oil from the Middle East, it consumes a lot of oil. In fact, oil is the biggest source of energy here in the United States and around the world. And so the US economy is dependent on oil. And the second important point is that the Middle East region is important for the world oil market, and that it accounts for about 1/3 of all of the production. And many of the countries in the region engage in actively managing the market, and they hold spare production capacity, which gives them outside importance in managing when things go wrong. And the reason why this matters for the United States is because, the price of oil matters for the US economy. And as long as the United States is dependent on oil, it will be dependent on the developments in the Middle East, because in a global market, if the price goes up anywhere, it goes up everywhere. Now that may change. Over time, if we pursue an aggressive transition to a low carbon energy future, US dependence on oil in our economy could be reduced, and that could reduce our dependence on Middle Eastern developments in terms of what it means for the oil market. But that change is likely to take place slowly.
I was looking at whether or not perceptions of US disengagement from the Gulf are just those perceptions, or whether there's any basis in reality. I began by making the point that the elevated troop levels, the elevated levels of force the US has had in the Gulf since the beginning of the war on terror, with the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan after 2001, meant that that was a way away from the long-term mean. The US was never engaged as heavily in the Middle East before. And so in a sense, the reversion towards that long-term mean of a lower military footprint has been taken in some respects to imply disengagement. There have also been other specific decisions over 3 successive administrations, Obama, Trump and Biden. And that has led to issues such as the Abraham Accords, the UAE and Israel beginning to think about moving closer together. And of course, most recently, the Iran, Saudi Arabia, China decision to work together to restore diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, using the Chinese, not the Americans, as an interlocutor, in part because the Americans could never have put together a deal because they don't have a relationship with Iran. So we're seeing a divergence of interests.
Looking at how feasible US's sort of pivot from the region, if we accept that there is such a thing, is given the challenges that Iran poses and the fact that there's not a realistic prospect for resolving those challenges, and to look at what role Russia and China play as we move towards the future and as Iran's nuclear program expands.
The importance of looking inside the Middle East to understand the conditions of the citizens, the states, the governments, the power elites, and their interests and their sentiments, in order to fully understand the dynamic related to any possible pivot by the US, entries into the Middle East more by Russians and Chinese and other people, and all the tremendous changes happening in the region, geostrategic changes, policy changes, relationships, coalitions. You need to really look into the countries first, see what's going on inside. And the main point I made
is that we have a continuing expansion of pauperization of poor people, that 70% approximately of the region is made of poor and vulnerable and marginalized people. They have no political power. They have no serious way to hold power accountable. They can barely express their opinion anymore because of the control of media. And there's great frustration, and this is something that is going to impact how these countries evolve, and therefore the relationships of these increasingly authoritarian Arab and other Middle Eastern countries, Israel, Turkey, Iran, their relationships with the big powers of the world.
I took the opportunity to examine the claims of a U.S. pivot away from the Middle East to argue that there has been no pivot, even though there was an intention and an aim for a pivot. In fact, powerful interests, foreign interests in the defense industry lobby assured it would never happen. And in fact, the expanded military and security interests in the Middle East don't actually serve the interests of the American people or the interests of the people of the region, but rather the foreign interests and defense industry lobby who gain from continued U.S. military and political support.